The diner was almost empty now, the rush slowly fading into the quiet hum of the late evening. She stood behind the counter, her apron slightly stained from a day filled with orders, coffee spills, and the constant clatter of plates. Her feet throbbed with exhaustion, the soreness from standing for hours settling deep into her muscles. Every night felt like this long, tiring, and never-ending, but she had learned to push through. It wasn't just a job. It was survival, a way to keep her small apartment, pay a few bills, and make sure there was food on her table. The fluorescent lights flickered slightly overhead, casting a pale glow over the diner. It was one of those nights when the air felt heavy, and every little sound, the bell above the door, the drip of the coffee machine, the soft hum of a distant radio was magnified. She had been moving almost mechanically, taking orders, pouring coffee, and refilling ketchup bottles. Her mind half on the tasks at hand and half on the invisible weight pressing down on her. A table near the window caught her attention. A man sat there alone, stirring his coffee slowly. He didn't look up when she approached, didn't smile, didn't even nod. He seemed absorbed in some private thought, his eyes staring blankly at the table. She gave a polite greeting anyway, forcing a smile, one that felt practiced and tired at the same time. "Good evening, sir. Can I get you anything to drink?" He looked up briefly, his eyes flicking toward her, then returned to his cup. "Coffee? Black," he said quietly. No pleasantries, no warmth, just words delivered in a flat tone. She nodded and poured his coffee, the steam rising in a small swirl before dissipating into the cool air. She felt a small knot of disappointment in her chest, but told herself it didn't matter. Some people were just quiet, she thought. Some people just had their own world they carried around with them. She moved on to the next table, taking orders from a young couple who were laughing and sharing stories. The energy of their conversation made her smile without effort. She liked moments like these, when people's joy seemed contagious, when the stress of her day lifted for just a few minutes. But the small warmth from that table couldn't last. It was quickly replaced by the steady rhythm of work. Plates to clear, drinks to refill, orders to take. The man at the window continued his silent vigil. He sipped his coffee slowly, almost methodically, as if timing each swallow, each breath, each movement. She noticed the worn edges of the newspaper he had spread on the table, the crumpled sleeve of his jacket, the faint scuff marks on his shoes. There was something deliberate in the way he moved, something quiet and careful. For reasons she didn't understand, it made her uneasy. Not in a dangerous way, just a strange, uncomfortable awareness that someone was carrying a weight she couldn't see. She returned to his table when his cup was empty. "Would you like anything else?" she asked, her tone soft but professional. He shook his head, glancing briefly at her before returning to his newspaper. She nodded and moved away, wiping her hands on her apron, trying to shake off the tension that seemed to stick to her skin like a shadow. As the night wore on, the diner grew quieter. The laughter and chatter that had filled the air hours before had faded, leaving only the low hum of machines and the occasional clatter of dishes. She found herself glancing back at the man more than once. There was nothing unusual about him. No one would have called him strange. But there was a stillness that didn't belong to the night. It was as if he carried something heavy and private, a weight she could sense even without knowing its shape. When he finally stood to leave, she forced another smile, hopeful for even the smallest sign of appreciation. "Thank you, sir. Have a good night," she said, trying to infuse warmth into her voice. He nodded briefly, said nothing, and left. The bell above the door jingled softly, marking his departure. She moved toward the table, expecting at least the small comfort of a tip, but there was nothing. The receipt lay folded neatly on the edge of the table, exactly where he had left it. No tip, no words. No sign that her effort had been noticed. Her chest sank slightly, a familiar sting that she had learned to endure many times before. She stacked the dishes mechanically, cleaned the table, and moved on to her next task. The hurt was there, quiet and persistent, a dull ache beneath the surface. She had grown used to it, but that didn't make it any easier. She paused for a moment, leaning slightly against the counter, trying to shake the heaviness in her chest. She thought about all the customers she had served that day, all the smiles she had forced, all the conversations she had managed to keep polite and light even when she felt tired and invisible. And yet, it was nights like this that reminded her how fragile the sense of appreciation could be. A simple thank you, a kind word, or even a small tip could feel like a lifeline after hours of relentless work. The diner was quiet now, and she took a moment to breathe, to feel the exhaustion settle into her bones. Her thoughts drifted to home, to the small apartment waiting for her, to the thin mattress that promised some rest but no luxury. She imagined slipping into bed, letting the day's weight fall off her shoulders. And for a few minutes she allowed herself a moment of relief. But even in that imagined comfort, the sting of the unpaid tip lingered. It wasn't just about the money, she realized. It was about recognition, about seeing that someone noticed her effort, that someone valued the work she did quietly, patiently, day after day. Without it, the job felt heavier, the night longer, and the weight of the world pressing down a little more insistently. She shook her head slightly, trying to banish the thought. There would be other nights, other tables, other opportunities for small gestures of kindness. She had learned not to expect them, not to rely on them, but the human part of her, the part that longed to be seen and appreciated, still hoped. Even a tiny acknowledgement could make a difference. Even a single smile could lift the spirit after hours of fatigue. The remaining customers were few, but each brought their own energy to the diner. A couple of late-night workers came in, hungry and tired, chatting quietly about their day. She served them with practiced ease, refilling coffee cups, bringing plates of food and exchanging polite smiles. Each interaction, while routine, was a small victory, a reminder that not every moment was marked by disappointment. Still, the man's empty table haunted her mind. She found herself glancing back at it more than once, expecting some small sign that she had been noticed, some acknowledgement that her service mattered. But there was nothing. Only the folded receipt, the empty cup, and the faint echo of footsteps fading into the night. As she wiped down the counter and stacked chairs, she felt a strange mix of emotions: fatigue, frustration, and an unspoken longing. The work was hard, the hours long, and the gratitude rare, but she had learned to keep moving forward. She had learned that the night would eventually end, that the world would keep turning, and that tomorrow would bring another day, another set of tables, another chance to try again. Yet deep inside, she carried a quiet hope that tonight might be different. She didn't know how or why, but there was a feeling, a subtle pull that made her linger a little longer at the table. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, perhaps a tip, perhaps a word of thanks, perhaps just a small sign that her efforts mattered. She couldn't explain it, and she didn't even know if it was reasonable to expect it. But something told her not to leave the table just yet, not to walk away entirely, and so she stayed. Moving slowly, wiping the edge of the table one last time, adjusting the chairs, listening to the quiet hum of the diner, and letting the night settle around her. She didn't know it yet, but this ordinary, exhausting night was about to take a turn, a small twist that would change everything she thought she knew about recognition, kindness, and the hidden ways people touch each other's lives. The man was gone. The tip was absent. The smile she had offered remained unreturned. And yet, there was something tucked beneath the edges of the ordinary. Something waiting to be discovered. Small, secret, hidden in plain sight. Quiet but powerful. Ready to remind her that not everything could be measured in dollars or acknowledgement, she leaned against the counter again, closed her eyes for a brief moment, and let out a long breath. The diner was silent except for the soft ticking of the clock, the faint hum of the refrigerator, and the occasional drip of the coffee machine. The weight of the night pressed down, but beneath it there was a tiny spark, a subtle promise that even when recognition was absent, the world still had its ways of surprising those who worked quietly, tirelessly, and with a heart that still cared. She didn't know it yet, but the story was just beginning. The diner was quieter now. The clock ticked slowly above the counter, marking the hours in a steady, unrelenting rhythm. She wiped down the tables, her hands moving automatically, the motions practiced and precise. Her feet ached, her back protested, but she barely noticed anymore. This was part of the job: the long hours, the aches. the unspoken expectation that she would keep going no matter how tired she felt. Her thoughts, however, were harder to control. The man who had left without a tip lingered in her mind. It wasn't just the money, it was the sense of invisibility that came with it. She had smiled, tried to be kind, tried to make the small moment of his evening better, and received nothing in return. It wasn't the first time she had felt this way, but tonight, somehow, it stung more. Maybe it was the exhaustion, or the silence of the diner that seemed to echo her disappointment back to her. She poured herself a small cup of coffee from the pot that had been brewing for hours. The warm liquid a temporary comfort. She sat on the edge of an empty booth, resting her elbows on the table, letting her mind drift. She thought about her life outside the diner, the tiny apartment that barely fit her furniture, the stack of bills she had been avoiding, the grocery store shelves she would face tomorrow with a tight budget. Every tip mattered, every dollar mattered. And yet, some nights, no matter how much she gave, it felt like the world had forgotten to notice her at all. Her eyes wandered to the window where the man had sat. The table was empty, the chair pushed in neatly, as if nothing had happened. But she could still see him there in her mind, the quiet way he had held himself, the careful movements, the unreadable expression. She wondered what had been on his mind. Perhaps he had been having a bad day. Perhaps he had just been lost in thought. Perhaps there was a story she would never know. She reminded herself again not to take it personally. People were complicated. People had their struggles. And sometimes, kindness was not met with acknowledgement. She sighed and pushed herself up from the booth. There was still work to be done, and she couldn't let herself fall into the spiral of frustration. The dishes needed washing, the tables needed clearing, and the last few customers would soon need attention. She moved with the quiet determination of someone who had learned to keep going, even when the world didn't give much in return. As she carried a tray of empty glasses to the sink, she caught herself thinking about the small joys of the job, the few customers who smiled genuinely, who left little notes of thanks, who made her feel seen. Those moments were rare, but they existed. They were the reason she kept coming back, the reason she endured the long hours, the aches, and the moments of invisibility. She clung to those tiny sparks, letting them remind her that not every day was defined by disappointment. She washed the glasses carefully, listening to the soft splash of water and the rhythmic clink of glass against glass. It was soothing in a strange way, a meditation of sorts. Her mind wandered again, thinking about the man's silence, the absence of a tip, the emptiness left behind on the table. There was something about it that felt unfinished, as if a small piece of the night's story had been left unresolved. She shook her head, trying to dismiss the thought. Some things were beyond her control. Some things were meant to remain a mystery. Still, a small part of her felt unsettled. She couldn't explain why, but there was a tug at her curiosity, a sense that there was more to this simple, quiet man than met the eye. She had served countless customers in her life, but this one had left a peculiar subtle weight that made her pause, made her question, made her linger longer at the table he had left behind. She returned to the counter, drying her hands on a towel, and glanced around the diner. The few remaining customers were scattered, quietly finishing their meals. The radio played softly in the background, a gentle tune that filled the otherwise still air. She felt a mixture of fatigue and restlessness, the two emotions twisting together in her chest. It was a familiar feeling, one she had known for years, but tonight it seemed sharper, more pronounced. Her thoughts drifted again to the unpaid tip. She knew it was a small thing in the grand scheme of life, but tonight it felt like more. It wasn't greed that gnawed at her, it was recognition, acknowledgement. It's the simple human need to feel that one's efforts mattered. She had given her best, as she always did, and to receive nothing in return felt like a tiny fracture in her spirit. She shook her head again, trying to banish the thought. There would be other tables, other chances to feel appreciated. She had learned not to let moments like this define her. And yet she found herself glancing back at the empty table, almost expecting anything that might explain the silence. The absence, the lack of acknowledgement it was then. As she wiped down the edge of the table, that something caught her eye. A small piece of paper, folded neatly, tucked just beneath the corner of the receipt. She hadn't noticed it before, but now it seemed impossible to miss. Her heart skipped a beat, a mixture of curiosity and hesitation rising in her chest. She bent down, carefully lifting the paper, wondering what it could be at first. She thought it might be trash, another scrap of paper left behind by a previous customer. But as she unfolded it, she realized it was a note, written in neat, careful handwriting. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened it fully, her eyes scanning the words. The note was unexpected. It wasn't a tip. It wasn't money. It wasn't a standard thank you. It was something more personal, something that carried a depth she hadn't anticipated. The handwriting was precise, deliberate, almost hesitant in places, as if the writer had struggled to find the right words. She felt a strange mixture of anticipation and fear, unsure of what she would find within those lines. As she read, a lump formed in her throat. The note explained in simple, honest terms why there had been no tip. The man had been going through a difficult time, struggling with challenges she could barely imagine. He wasn't ungrateful. He wasn't unkind. He had simply been unable to offer more. And yet, the note carried gratitude, respect, and something else. A quiet recognition of her effort. A deep appreciation that didn't need to be measured in dollars. She read the note again, slowly, savoring each word, letting it sink in. Her heart began to soften, the tension that had been building throughout the evening slowly easing. For the first time that night, she felt truly seen, truly acknowledged in a way that went beyond money or a smile. The note was a small, hidden treasure, a gesture of humanity that transcended the ordinary transactions of the diner. Her mind wandered, imagining the life of the man who had left it behind. Perhaps he had faced struggles she could not comprehend, battles fought in silence, burdens carried alone. And yet, despite everything, he had taken the time to leave a message, to communicate his gratitude in a quiet, thoughtful way. It was a reminder that kindness often comes in unexpected forms, that recognition is not always immediate or obvious, and that the human spirit can find ways to connect, even when circumstances are difficult. She held the note in her hands, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the diner or her exhaustion. It was a small, profound reminder that the world was not always cold or indifferent. People noticed. People cared, even if it was not always visible on the surface. And sometimes, the most meaningful gestures were hidden, waiting for someone to discover them at the right moment. The rest of the night passed differently. She moved through her tasks with a renewed sense of purpose. The fatigue still present, but lighter somehow, less oppressive. The remaining customers were served with the same care and attention as before. But now, there was a subtle shift in her demeanor, quiet confidence, a gentle warmth that radiated from within. She realized that the note had changed her perspective, had reminded her of the power of small gestures and unseen kindness. By the time the diner closed, she had carefully placed the note in her pocket, intending to keep it as a reminder of the unexpected beauty she had encountered that night. She swept the floor, wiped down the counters, and turned off the lights. Feeling a sense of closure that had been absent earlier, the night no longer felt heavy and empty. It felt full of quiet meaning, a subtle affirmation that her efforts mattered, even when unrecognized in conventional ways. As she stepped out into the cool night air, the city lights shimmering softly in the distance, she felt a sense of calm she hadn't expected. The exhaustion remained, but it was tempered by a quiet joy, a small but powerful reminder that life could surprise, could uplift, and could connect people in ways that went beyond words or money. She walked home slowly, the note still tucked safely in her pocket, a tangible symbol of the night's lesson. Sometimes recognition comes in the smallest packages, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to notice. And sometimes it changes everything. Tonight had been one of those nights. She walked the familiar route home, the city streets quiet and empty except for the occasional car passing by, and the distant hum of a streetlight buzzing overhead. The night air was cool, brushing against her skin in a way that was both refreshing and calming. In her pocket, the small folded note pressed gently against her hand. a secret weight that felt lighter than it should have, and heavier than she could explain, every step she took. She kept thinking about the words she had read. They were simple, honest words, written by a person who had struggled, yet still tried to reach out in gratitude. She had read the note over and over in her mind, savoring each sentence, each phrase, each carefully chosen word. It was strange how a few lines on paper could carry so much meaning, so much humanity. She realized that she had been carrying her exhaustion and frustration like armor, protecting herself from disappointment. But now that armor seemed unnecessary, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a lightness she hadn't expected. When she arrived at her apartment building, she paused at the door, glancing back at the empty street behind her. The world seemed quieter somehow, softer, and she could almost hear the echoes of the diner, the clinking of dishes, the hum of conversation, and the invisible presence of the man who had left the note. She felt a strange connection to him, though they had never spoken beyond the brief interaction that evening. It was as if the note had bridged an invisible gap between two people, connecting them in a fleeting but meaningful moment. Inside her apartment, she set her bag down on the small table near the door, kicked off her shoes, and sank into the chair by the window. She unfolded the note again, reading it carefully, savoring the words like a rare treat. The note explained that the man had been struggling with his own difficulties, challenges she could hardly imagine. He had been facing obstacles that made even the simplest acts, like leaving a tip, feel impossible. But he had taken the time to acknowledge her effort, to express gratitude in a way that didn't require money or overt gestures. She felt a lump form in her throat as she read the note again. It wasn't just the words themselves, it was the thought behind them. The recognition that even when someone is silent, even when someone seems distant or detached, they may still notice and appreciate the effort of others. She realized that the diner, the long hours, the aching feet, and the endless routine had not been meaningless. Even when unacknowledged, her work had mattered to someone. The note seemed to grow heavier in her hands. Not in a burdensome way, but in a way that demanded reflection. She thought about all the customers she had served over the years, the ones who had smiled, the ones who had ignored her, the ones who had left without a word. She had always measured her day by the smiles she received, the tips she earned, the fleeting moments of recognition. But now she understood that there was more to it than that. Her efforts mattered even when unseen, her care mattered even when unrecognized, and her humanity mattered even when overlooked. For the first time, she allowed herself to think about her own life with a sense of possibility. She had been so focused on surviving, on meeting the demands of her job, and keeping her small world in order, that she had forgotten to notice the small sparks of meaning that existed all around her. The note was a reminder that life was full of unseen gestures, quiet acknowledgments, and hidden kindnesses. It was a nudge to look deeper, to pay attention, to be open to the subtleties that often went unnoticed. She placed the note on the table in front of her, stared at it for a long time. The handwriting, the careful phrasing, the honesty, it all felt like a gift. She thought about the man who had left it, imagining him sitting quietly in the diner, struggling with his own burdens, and yet taking the time to acknowledge her work. The image brought a small smile to her lips, a genuine smile that felt unforced and warm as she sat there. The fatigue of the day began to ebb, replaced by a quiet energy. She realized that she had spent so many nights carrying disappointment, frustration, and exhaustion that she had forgotten how it felt to be seen, to be acknowledged, to matter. The note was small, simple, and yet powerful enough to change her perspective, to shift her understanding of herself, her work, and the world around her. She thought about the other customers she had served that evening, the interactions that had felt ordinary, the moments that had seemed mundane. Suddenly, those moments took on new meaning. Every small act of kindness, every effort to be patient, every gesture of care, no matter how small, had the potential to matter to someone in ways she could never predict. The realization was profound, almost overwhelming. Her mind wandered further, reflecting on the countless times she had felt invisible, unappreciated, or ignored. She thought about the nights when she had returned home exhausted, empty-handed, carrying only the weight of a long day. The note was a revelation, a reminder that even when recognition was absent, her efforts were not wasted. She had been contributing to the world in ways that were subtle, hidden, and yet meaningful. She picked up the note again, tracing the lines with her fingers, and felt a surge of gratitude herself. It was strange how a simple act, a few words on a small piece of paper, could carry so much weight, so much emotion, so much humanity. She realized that she had underestimated the power of words, the impact of acknowledgement, the importance of recognizing the unseen struggles of others. The night stretched on, quiet and still. She sat by the window, the note in her hand, thinking about the world beyond her apartment, beyond the diner, beyond the small circle of her daily life. She imagined the countless other people carrying burdens, facing challenges, and struggling in silence. And she understood that her work, her care, her patience, and her humanity had the potential to touch those lives. Even in ways she might never see, she thought about tomorrow. The next shift, and the long hours ahead. She knew it wouldn't be easy, that the challenges would remain, and that the exhaustion would return. But now, she felt a quiet strength, a subtle resilience that she hadn't felt before. The note had reminded her that meaning was not always obvious, that recognition was not always immediate, and that the impact of her efforts could be hidden yet profound. She placed the note back in her pocket, careful not to crumple it, and stood up, stretching her tired muscles. She looked around her small apartment, the familiar furniture and worn floorboards, and felt a sense of peace. The night was far from over, but she was no longer carrying the weight of disappointment alone. She had been reminded that even in the ordinary, even in the mundane, there was significance. There was connection. There was humanity. As she prepared for bed, she thought about the man who had left the note, imagining him going about his life, carrying his own burdens, and yet taking the time to acknowledge hers. She felt a deep sense of empathy, a quiet understanding, and a subtle shift in her perspective. The world, she realized, was more complex, more interconnected, and more filled with hidden kindness than she had previously believed. Lying in bed, she held the note close for a moment before placing it on the nightstand. She stared at it, marveling at the small miracle it represented, a bridge between two strangers. A moment of recognition, a gesture of humanity that had arrived when she least expected it. The night was quiet, the city outside silent, and yet her heart was full in a way that words could hardly describe. She closed her eyes, allowing herself to rest, feeling the exhaustion of the day dissolve into a gentle calm. The note had given her more than words. It had given her perspective, hope, and a renewed sense of purpose. She understood now that her work, her care, and her attention mattered, not because of recognition or reward, but because of the simple, profound truth that every act of kindness, however small, had the potential to touch someone else's life. And in that quiet, reflective moment, she drifted into sleep, carrying with her the hidden note, the memory of the diner, and the understanding that even in a world that often seemed indifferent, there were connections waiting to be discovered, acknowledgments waiting to be revealed, and moments of humanity waiting to be found in the most unexpected places. The morning sun slipped slowly through the blinds, casting long golden lines across her small apartment. She woke with a lingering sense of warmth in her chest, a subtle reminder of the note tucked carefully on her nightstand. It was still folded neatly, its presence a quiet encouragement, a small beacon of human kindness that had reached her in the most unexpected way. She reached over and touched it briefly, feeling the weight of the paper, the weight of its message, the weight of the moment that had changed something inside her. She dressed quickly for work, her movements deliberate but light, almost buoyant. The long hours, the exhaustion, and the constant hum of effort awaited her at the diner. But for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like she was carrying it alone. The note had shifted something deep inside her, a sense that her work mattered, that her efforts were seen, even if not in obvious ways, and that small gestures, however quiet, could carry enormous power. As she stepped out into the city streets, the morning felt different. The familiar sounds, the distant roar of traffic, the occasional honk of a horn, The soft rustle of leaves in the breeze sounded sharper, clearer, almost purposeful. She noticed things she had ignored countless times before, the way sunlight danced across a building, the way a pigeon bobbed along the sidewalk, the faint scent of coffee drifting from a nearby cafe. Everything seemed alive, connected, and meaningful. She arrived at the diner and greeted her coworkers with the usual tired smiles. But inside her, there was a lightness, a quiet sense of hope. Today, she decided, she would approach her work differently. She would still serve the food, clean the tables, and refill the coffee. But she would do it with awareness, with presence, with the understanding that every small act mattered in ways she might never see. The first customer of the morning was a man who looked tired, worn, and a little frustrated. He barely made eye contact and muttered his order quietly. Normally, she would have offered a polite smile, moved on quickly, and carried on with her tasks. But today, something inside her stirred. She leaned slightly forward, softening her voice, and said, "I'll make sure your coffee is just the way you like it. Take your time, okay?" The man looked up at her, surprised, a flicker of something gratitude, perhaps relief passing across his face. He nodded briefly, and for the first time, she noticed the subtle tension in his shoulders begin to ease. She moved away to prepare his coffee. But the image of that small acknowledgement stayed with her, and a quiet smile crept onto her own face. Throughout the morning, the diner filled gradually. Regular customers arrived, and she served each one with a new sense of patience and attention. She noticed details she had previously ignored, the young mother struggling to calm her restless child, the elderly man carefully counting coins for his meal, the shy teenager who lingered near the counter before summoning the courage to order. She approached each interaction with care, with empathy, with the understanding that her effort could ripple outward in ways she would never fully witness. During a brief lull in the morning rush, she glanced down at the note again. Its words seemed alive, resonating within her, reminding her that even small gestures of thoughtfulness could transform someone's day. She thought about the man who had left it, imagining him carrying his own burdens. And she felt a sense of connection, a sense of shared humanity that transcended time and place. It was a subtle shift, but powerful, shaping how she experienced the world around her. A group of customers arrived, laughing and chatting loudly, carrying the kind of energy that could easily feel overwhelming. Normally, she would have been irritated by the noise, distracted by the chaos, wishing for the room to quiet down. But today, she felt differently. She watched them carefully, smiled when appropriate, and served them attentively. She noticed the way one of them spilled coffee on the table and reacted immediately with understanding, offering napkins and a small joke to lighten the mood. The laughter that followed wasn't just theirs. It was shared, subtle, and real, and she felt herself drawn into it without losing her own sense of purpose. Throughout the morning, she realized something important: her attitude, her energy, and her attention mattered more than she had ever imagined. The note had taught her that recognition was not always overt, not always immediate, but it existed. Her presence, her effort, her patience, her care, they were all forms of acknowledgement in themselves, and they could transform ordinary moments into something meaningful for others. By midday, the diner was busy. She moved swiftly, efficiently, but with intention. She greeted each customer warmly, noticed small details, and offered extra care where it was needed. A young couple at a corner table seemed nervous, glancing at each other as they whispered quietly. She brought their order with a gentle smile, and when one of their drinks arrived slightly warmer than expected, she quickly offered to replace it, adding a small comment about how she hoped this one was perfect. The couple relaxed immediately, their tension easing, and she felt a subtle satisfaction, a recognition that her small attentions had made a difference. The lunch rushed past, leaving a quiet calm in the diner once again. She leaned against the counter briefly, catching her breath, and glanced at the note tucked into her pocket. Its presence reminded her that even when the day felt heavy, even when fatigue weighed down her spirit, there was meaning in her work, meaning in her care, meaning in the quiet attentions she offered every day, later in the afternoon. Another customer arrived, a man who looked discouraged, almost defeated, carrying the weight of the world in his shoulders. She approached him with a smile, asking gently what he would like. As he gave his order, she listened carefully, responding with small gestures of understanding, a nod here, a reassuring comment there. By the time he received his meal, she noticed his posture relax slightly, his eyes soften, and a small, grateful smile appear. It was fleeting, subtle, but unmistakable. And for the first time in a long while, she felt the profound satisfaction of truly making a difference. The rest of the day unfolded in a similar pattern. She noticed little things: the barista struggling with a complicated coffee machine, a customer leaving a small thank you note on a napkin, a child laughing at a silly joke. Each moment was small, ordinary, and yet together. They formed a tapestry of connection and meaning that she had never fully appreciated before. The note had opened her eyes to the hidden impact of her work, the unseen ways in which her presence mattered, and the quiet but real influence she had on the lives of those around her. As the evening approached, she felt a sense of calm satisfaction, a quiet joy that had nothing to do with tips or recognition, and everything to do with the awareness that she was part of something larger than herself. The diner, the customers, the laughter, the struggles, the quiet gestures of appreciation, all of it formed a complex, interconnected web of humanity, and she was a thread in that web, contributing in ways she could not always measure. When the man who had left the note walked into the diner again, she recognized him immediately. There was a subtle shift in the air, a quiet anticipation, as if the universe had orchestrated this moment to reaffirm the lesson she had learned. He approached the counter, his movements careful, almost hesitant, and she greeted him with a warm, genuine smile, the first in many days that felt completely effortless. He returned the smile, slightly surprised, and there was a moment of recognition in his eyes. She handed him his coffee, and for a brief instant the diner felt suspended, as if the world had paused to acknowledge the quiet connection between them. No words were necessary. Everything had already been said in the note, in the gesture, in the shared understanding that sometimes acknowledgement transcends speech, transcends money, transcends expectation. The evening continued, the diner gradually emptying as night approached. She cleaned tables, washed dishes, and moved through the routine with ease, her movements steady, her heart lighter. She thought about the impact of the note, the lessons she had learned, the subtle but profound shifts in her perspective. The night had transformed her, teaching her that recognition is not always obvious, that kindness can be hidden, and that every small gesture of care carries weight far beyond what we can see. Finally, when the last customer left, she turned off the lights and stepped outside, the cool night air wrapping around her like a soft blanket. She walked home slowly, reflecting on the day, the lessons she had learned, and the quiet power of human connection. The note had been more than words on paper. It had been a catalyst, a spark, a subtle shift that illuminated the unseen meaning of her efforts and the hidden ways in which people notice and care. As she reached her apartment, she paused for a moment, taking a deep breath and letting the night sink in. She placed the note carefully on her nightstand, her heart full, her mind clear, and a quiet sense of gratitude washing over her. The world was still full of challenges, still full of unseen burdens, still full of moments of disappointment, but it was also full of hidden gestures, quiet acknowledgments, and unexpected connections that made it all worthwhile. Tonight, she understood something she hadn't before: the value of her work, the impact of her care, and the subtle but real influence of her presence could not always be measured in tips, smiles, or words. Sometimes the most profound recognition comes quietly, unexpectedly, and leaves a mark that lasts far longer than any fleeting moment of acknowledgement. She climbed into bed, the note resting nearby, a silent testament to the lessons of the day. She closed her eyes, feeling the exhaustion of hours spent standing, moving, and serving slowly dissolve into a calm, steady warmth. The diner, the customers, the struggles, the gestures of kindness, they all had meaning, all had purpose, all had power. and in that understanding, she found a quiet joy, a deep satisfaction, and a renewed sense of hope for the days to come. The morning light filtered softly through her apartment window, illuminating the small, familiar space she called home. She sat on the edge of her bed, holding the folded note in her hands. It had become something precious to her, a symbol of something more than recognition or money. It was proof that her efforts mattered, that her presence had weight, that human connection could arrive in quiet, unexpected ways. She thought about the previous day at the diner, the way she had carried herself differently, the way she had noticed things she never had before, the subtle but meaningful changes in her interactions. The note had shifted something inside her, opened a door to seeing the world with more patience, more empathy, and more understanding. It was remarkable, the power of a few simple words, and she couldn't stop smiling as she traced the edges of the paper with her fingers. Her phone buzzed softly on the nightstand, a reminder of the day ahead. She ignored it for a moment, allowing herself a few more minutes of quiet reflection. The night had been transformative, yes, but today promised more opportunity for change, more chance to carry forward the lesson she had learned. She tucked the note safely into her pocket, close to her heart, and prepared for the day. At the diner, the morning rush began like any other day. She moved through it with a lightness she had not felt in years, noticing small details she had previously overlooked. The sunlight streaming through the windows illuminated the tables, plates, the people seated in quiet conversation or hurried breakfast. Every interaction, every smile, every sigh became something to notice, something to honor, something to respond to with care.